The morning mist clung to Puget Sound like a shroud, and Lieutenant Commander Marcus Webb thought it would be another routine patrol. His Coast Guard cutter, the Vigilant, sliced through the gray waters with mechanical precision, its crew of 12 going through the familiar motions of maritime law enforcement. Webb had been doing this for 8 years, and he'd seen every kind of smuggler, tax evader, and weekend warrior trying to bend the rules. But what he was about to encounter would shake everything he thought he knew about duty, honor, and the hidden wars fought in shadows. The radar operator, Petty Officer Jenkins, called out from his station. Contact bearing 270, range 4 miles. Small craft, approximately 35 feet, running dark. Webb raised his binoculars, squinting through the haze. There it was, a sleek fishing boat moving with purpose through waters that should have been empty at this hour. No registration lights, no transponder signal, just a ghost cutting through the dawn. Suspicious activity, Webb muttered, feeling that familiar tingle of a potential bust. Drug runners love these conditions: poor visibility, early morning, minimal traffic. All stop, prepare boarding party. The engines wound down to an idle and the Vigilant turned toward the mysterious vessel. Webb had intercepted hundreds of boats in these waters, but something about this one felt different. Maybe it was the way it moved, too smooth, too calculated. Or maybe it was the complete absence of panic when his spotlight found it. The fishing boat didn't attempt to flee. Instead, it maintained course and speed as if the appearance of a Coast Guard cutter was merely an inconvenience. Webb frowned. Smugglers either ran or surrendered immediately. They didn't ignore armed federal agents. "Hail them," he ordered. The radio man's voice crackled across the water. "Unknown vessel, this is United States Coast Guard cutter Vigilant. Heave to immediately for boarding and inspection." Silence stretched across the Sound, broken only by the gentle lapping of waves against hulls. Then, through the static, came a voice that would haunt Webb's dreams for years to come. It was calm, measured, with the kind of authority that came from facing death and walking away unchanged. "Coast Guard vessel, this is the fishing vessel Redemption. I am preparing to come about and comply with your request." The voice belonged to a woman, and something in its tone made Webb's seasoned crew exchange glances. This wasn't fear or defiance. It was the sound of someone who had faced far worse than a routine maritime inspection. As the Redemption turned toward them, Webb couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to step into something much bigger than smuggling or tax evasion. The morning mist seemed to thicken, and the Sound fell unnaturally quiet, as if the water itself was holding its breath. Webb's boarding party consisted of 3 men: Petty Officer Rodriguez, a 10-year veteran with arms like tree trunks; Seaman Collins, young and eager to prove himself; and Chief Warrant Officer Thompson, whose weathered face had seen everything the Pacific could throw at him. They approached the Redemption in their rigid inflatable boat, weapons secured but ready, following protocols that had been drilled into them countless times. The fishing boat was immaculate. Not the kind of pristine that came from weekend use, but the surgical cleanliness of someone who understood that details could mean the difference between life and death. The deck was clear of clutter, lines coiled with military precision, and every surface gleamed despite the early hour. Rodriguez noticed it first, the way the boat sat in the water, heavier than it should be for its size. "She's loaded," he whispered to Thompson, who nodded grimly. As their rib bumped against the Redemption's hull, a figure emerged from the cabin. She was smaller than Webb had expected, maybe 5'6", with shoulder-length auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her clothes were unremarkable jeans, a gray fleece jacket, weathered deck shoes. But it was her eyes that stopped the boarding party cold. They were the color of storm clouds, and they held the kind of steady gaze that comes from staring down rifle scopes and making decisions that haunt you forever. "Permission to come aboard?" Rodriguez asked, though it wasn't really a question. The woman nodded and stepped back, her movements economical and precise. No wasted motion, no nervous fidgeting. She stood with her feet slightly apart, hands visible, every inch the picture of compliance. But Thompson noticed how her weight was distributed, how her eyes tracked each member of the boarding party, cataloging positions and potential threats with the automatic assessment of someone trained to survive. "I'm Lieutenant Commander Webb," came the voice from the radio. "State your name and business in these waters." The woman reached slowly into her jacket pocket, and every Coast Guard weapon tensed slightly. But instead of producing a gun or contraband, she withdrew a worn leather wallet. "Captain Raven Mackenzie," she said, her voice carrying across the water with crisp authority. "And I believe you'll find my paperwork in order." Rodriguez took the wallet, expecting to find the usual collection of fishing licenses and registration documents. Instead, his fingers encountered something that made his blood run cold. The ID was unlike anything he'd seen in his decade of service: heavy cardstock, embedded with security features that seemed to shift in the morning light. But it was the insignia that made his hands tremble, a silver eagle clutching lightning bolts, surrounded by stars that seemed to pulse with their own inner fire. The silence stretched for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. Rodriguez stared at the ID, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Thompson moved closer, his weathered face going pale as he read the classification level printed in stark black letters. Collins, sensing the tension, kept his eyes on Mackenzie, who waited with the infinite patience of someone accustomed to having her credentials questioned. "Jesus Christ," Rodriguez whispered, his voice barely audible above the sound of water against hulls. The ID identified Captain Raven Mackenzie as a member of the 24th Special Tactics Squadron, with clearance levels that went far beyond anything a Coast Guard petty officer was supposed to see. But it was the small notation at the bottom that truly shook him: Operation Nightfall Classified. Even without knowing the specifics, Rodriguez understood that he was holding the credentials of someone who fought in wars that didn't officially exist. Mackenzie watched the realization dawn on their faces with the detached interest of someone who had seen this reaction before. "Is there a problem with my identification?" she asked, her tone neutral but carrying undertones that suggested she already knew the answer. The boarding party stood frozen, caught between their duty to inspect the vessel and the growing certainty that they were dealing with someone whose authority superseded their own. Thompson was the first to recover, his years of experience kicking in. "Ma'am, we're going to need to verify this with our command." Mackenzie nodded, as if this was exactly what she expected. "Of course, but I should mention that any inquiry regarding my current mission status will need to be routed through JSOC." The acronym hit the Coast Guard crew like a physical blow. Joint Special Operations Command didn't get involved in routine maritime enforcement. They dealt with terrorists, enemy combatants, and threats to national security that kept ordinary people sleeping peacefully in their beds. Back on the Vigilant, Webb felt his world shifting beneath his feet. The radio crackled with his team's report, each word more impossible than the last. Special Forces, classified operations, credentials that required clearance levels he didn't even know existed. He stared at the Redemption through his binoculars, trying to reconcile the quiet fishing boat with the implications of what his men were telling him. The morning mist began to lift, revealing the sound in sharp detail. Other vessels moved in the distance: commercial traffic, pleasure craft, the normal rhythm of maritime life. But the Redemption seemed to exist in its own bubble of silence, as if the water itself recognized the presence of something extraordinary. Webb found himself wondering what kind of mission would require someone of Mackenzie's apparent caliber to be operating alone in these waters, disguised as a weekend angler. Mackenzie stood motionless on her deck, watching the Coast Guard crew grapple with decisions far above their pay grade. She felt a familiar weariness settle over her, the weight of secrets and missions that could never be spoken aloud. The fishing boat was more than a cover. It was a lifeline to a world she'd almost forgotten existed, a world where the greatest threat was an overzealous game warden or a broken outboard motor. But that world was slipping away with each passing moment, replaced by the harsh reality of her true purpose. The radio in Webb's hand crackled to life. "Vigilant, this is District Command. We've received your inquiry regarding the vessel Redemption. Stand by for priority transmission." The voice carried a tension that Webb had never heard before, the kind of strain that came from phone calls to Washington and conferences with men whose names appeared on no public rosters. He found himself gripping the radio tighter, sensing that whatever came next would change everything. District Command's voice returned, carefully controlled but carrying undertones of barely contained shock. Vigilant, you are ordered to terminate your current boarding action immediately. Repeat, disengage from the vessel Redemption and return to standard patrol duties. This is a direct order from the district commander. Webb stared at the radio, his mind reeling. In 8 years of service, he'd never received orders to break off a boarding action. The Coast Guard didn't back down from smugglers or tax evaders. They certainly didn't abandon inspections based on mysterious credentials. District Command, request clarification. The vessel was operating without proper lighting in restricted waters. Webb's voice carried the confusion of a man watching his ordered world dissolve. The response came back immediately, sharp with authority. Vigilant, the operator of the Redemption has full authorization for her current activities. Any further inquiry must be directed through the Office of Naval Intelligence. You are ordered to clear the area immediately. On the Redemption, Mackenzie listened to the radio chatter with the weary familiarity of someone who had lived this scene too many times. She watched the Coast Guard crew's faces change as they processed orders that made no sense in their orderly world of maritime law enforcement. Rodriguez still held her credentials, staring at them as if they might provide answers to questions he was afraid to ask. Thompson's weathered features showed the recognition of someone who had served long enough to know that some doors were better left unopened. The morning sun broke through the mist, painting the sound in shades of gold and amber. Mackenzie felt the warmth on her face and allowed herself a moment of appreciation for the simple beauty of the scene. In another life, she might have been exactly what she appeared to be, a woman enjoying a morning on the water, fishing rod in hand, nothing more pressing than the tide schedule and the weather forecast. But that life belonged to someone else, someone who had never seen a muzzle flash in the Hindu Kush, or felt the weight of classified orders that could reshape the global balance of power. Webb's voice crackled across the water, tight with controlled frustration. "Ma'am, we're ordered to disengage. You're free to proceed." Mackenzie nodded, understanding the cost of those words. She had just watched 3 good men confront the reality that their world was far more complex and dangerous than they had imagined. The knowledge would follow them home, creeping into quiet moments and peaceful nights, a reminder that beneath the surface of ordinary life, extraordinary people fought battles that history would never record. "Thank you for your professionalism," Mackenzie called back, her voice carrying genuine respect. She understood what it meant to follow orders that defied logic, to trust in chains of command that stretched into shadows. As the Coast Guard crew prepared to return to their cutter, she felt the familiar weight of isolation settling around her like a familiar coat. The mission would continue, as it always did, carried by people whose names would never appear in newspapers or history books. The Vigilant began to pull away, its crew subdued and thoughtful. Webb watched the Redemption through his binoculars, memorizing every detail of the encounter that would dominate his thoughts for months to come. Mackenzie remained on deck until the Coast Guard cutter disappeared into the morning haze, then turned her attention back to the waters of Puget Sound. She had work to do, and the sun was climbing higher, burning away the mist that had provided perfect cover for activities that couldn't bear the light of day. As the Redemption resumed its course, Mackenzie allowed herself to think about the man she was hunting. Marcus Volkov had been a ghost for 3 years, slipping through the fingers of intelligence agencies across 2 continents. But ghosts left traces, and Mackenzie had spent her career learning to read the signs that others missed. The fishing boat was the perfect cover. Who would suspect a woman enjoying a peaceful morning on the water of tracking a Russian arms dealer whose network supplied weapons to terrorists across the Middle East? The first hint had come through electronic intercepts, fragments of conversation that mentioned a meeting in the Pacific Northwest. The second piece of the puzzle was financial, a series of transactions that traced back to a shell company in Seattle. But it was the third element that had brought Mackenzie to these waters. Satellite imagery showing unusual activity around a seemingly abandoned facility on one of the Sound's smaller islands. Taken individually, each piece of intelligence was meaningless. Together, they painted a picture of an operation that could destabilize half a dozen countries. Mackenzie checked her equipment with the methodical precision of someone whose life depended on functioning technology. The fishing boat's hull concealed surveillance gear that would have made the crew of a nuclear submarine envious. Passive sonar arrays tracked every vessel within a 20-mile radius. Encrypted communication systems provided direct links to command centers that didn't appear on any organizational chart. And hidden beneath the bait well, a weapons cache that included items the public assumed existed only in action movies. But it was the small device clipped to her belt that represented the true heart of the operation. The tracker showed a single red dot moving slowly across a digital map of the Sound. Somewhere ahead, Volkov was conducting business that would put American lives at risk. Mackenzie had been hunting him for 2 years, following his trail through Dubai, Istanbul, and finally to the seemingly peaceful waters of the Pacific Northwest. Today, the hunt would end, one way or another. The radio crackled to life, but this time it wasn't the Coast Guard. "Raven, this is Control. We have movement on the target. Volkov's vessel is approaching the rendezvous point." Mackenzie felt her pulse quicken, the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with the approach of contact. She had learned to embrace that feeling, to let it sharpen her focus without overwhelming her judgment. In her line of work, the difference between controlled excitement and reckless enthusiasm was often measured in heartbeats. "Copy Control, I'm 15 minutes out from the intercept point. Status on backup." The response came back immediately, professional and reassuring. "Seahawk is on station 5 miles north. Ground team is positioned on the island. You have full support." Mackenzie nodded, feeling the familiar comfort of knowing that professionals were watching her back. The mission might require her to operate alone, but she was never truly isolated. Somewhere above the clouds, a helicopter crew was monitoring her progress. On a rocky outcrop overlooking the target area, a sniper team was settling into position. The Redemption cut through the water with deceptive grace, its hull design concealing modifications that would have impressed a naval architect. The engines were far more powerful than they appeared, capable of speeds that would surprise anyone who saw them in action. The steering system had been upgraded with military-grade components that provided precise control even in rough seas. And the communications array, hidden beneath what appeared to be a simple fishing boat's electronics, could reach satellites orbiting hundreds of miles above the Earth. Mackenzie thought about the Coast Guard crew she had just encountered, their faces haunted by the collision between their ordered world and the chaotic reality of international espionage. She felt a pang of sympathy for them, remembering her own first glimpse behind the curtain of national security. There had been a time when she too believed that the world was a simpler place, where good and evil were clearly defined, and the rules were written down in manuals that everyone could read. That innocence had died on a mountainside in Afghanistan, when she watched her squadron leader disappear in a cloud of shrapnel, and realized that the enemy didn't care about rules or conventions. The lesson had been driven home during a mission in Syria, when she discovered that the freedom fighters they were supporting were selling weapons to the same terrorists they were supposed to be fighting. The world, she learned, was painted in shades of gray, and the people who kept it from dissolving into chaos were often forced to work in those shadowy spaces between black and white. The tracker on her belt chirped softly, indicating that the target was now within 5 miles. Mackenzie felt her breathing slow, her heartbeat settle into the steady rhythm that marked the beginning of operational focus. She had learned this technique during her first tour, when an older pilot had taught her that the secret to survival wasn't fearlessness. It was the ability to function effectively while afraid. Fear, properly channeled, could be a weapon as powerful as any missile or bomb. She thought about Volkov, trying to anticipate his next moves based on the psychological profile she had memorized. The Russian was smart, educated, and utterly without conscience. He sold death to anyone with enough money, justifying his actions with philosophical arguments about the nature of power and the inevitability of conflict. Mackenzie had read his intercepted communications, studied his patterns, and learned to think like him. It was a skill that had served her well in the field, though it came with a price that she paid in sleepless nights and haunted dreams. The island appeared through the morning haze, a rocky outcrop covered with scrub vegetation and crowned by the ruins of an old lighthouse. To most observers, it would have appeared uninhabited, just another piece of the Pacific Northwest's rugged coastline. But Mackenzie's trained eye caught the subtle signs of recent activity: disturbed vegetation, fresh tire tracks leading down to a hidden dock, and the faint outline of what appeared to be a communications antenna disguised as a dead tree. "Control, this is Raven. I have visual on the target location, confirming unusual activity consistent with the intelligence reports." The response came back immediately, crisp and professional. "Copy, Raven. Satellite imagery confirms multiple heat signatures on the island. Volkov's vessel is approaching from the southeast. You are cleared to proceed with the intercept." Mackenzie felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. Somewhere behind her, the Coast Guard crew was returning to their normal duties, probably discussing the morning's strange encounter over coffee and donuts. They would file their reports, answer their superiors' questions, and eventually convince themselves that what they had witnessed was simply another example of the military's tendency toward excessive secrecy. They would never know that their professional restraint had helped preserve an operation that would save thousands of lives. The Redemption rounded the island's northern point, and Mackenzie got her first clear view of the target area. A sleek yacht was anchored in a sheltered cove, its lines too aggressive for pleasure cruising, its communications array too sophisticated for simple navigation. Even from a distance, she could see armed men moving on the deck, their weapons held with the casual competence of professionals. This was Volkov's mobile command center, the nerve center of an operation that stretched from Moscow to Mogadishu. Through her binoculars, Mackenzie studied the yacht's defensive arrangements. The crew was alert but not panicked, suggesting that they felt secure in their remote location. Two men with automatic weapons patrolled the upper deck, while a third operated what appeared to be a sophisticated radar system. The yacht's position provided excellent fields of fire in all directions, and Mackenzie could see the outline of what looked like a heavy machine gun mounted behind a fake fishing chair. But it was the smaller boat approaching the yacht that held her attention. She recognized the hull design immediately, a high-speed interceptor favored by intelligence agencies for its combination of speed and stealth. The pilot was skilled, approaching the yacht with the kind of precision that suggested military training. This had to be Volkov's contact, the American trader who had been feeding classified information to the Russian arms dealer for the past 18 months. Mackenzie's radio crackled with an update from control. "Raven, we have identification on the approaching vessel. It's registered to a company owned by David Hartley, former Navy intelligence officer, discharged 3 years ago under circumstances that remain classified." The name sent a chill down Mackenzie's spine. She had heard whispers about Hartley, rumors of a promising career destroyed by gambling debts and compromised ethics. The intelligence community was small, and stories about fallen angels traveled fast. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with devastating clarity. Hartley had access to classified shipping schedules, naval patrol routes, and intelligence assessments that would be worth millions to someone like Volkov. In exchange, he was probably receiving enough money to solve his financial problems and fund the kind of lifestyle that his government salary could never support. It was a classic pattern, one that Mackenzie had seen repeated in briefings and case studies throughout her career. She watched through her binoculars as the interceptor pulled alongside the yacht, its pilot expertly bringing it to a perfect position for boarding. A figure emerged from the boat's cabin, tall, lean, with the kind of military bearing that never completely disappeared. Even from a distance, Mackenzie could see that this was a man who had once served his country with honor, before circumstances and choices had led him down a path that would end in betrayal and disgrace. The meeting was brief and businesslike. Hartley handed over what appeared to be a briefcase, receiving a similar container in return. No handshakes, no pleasantries, just the cold efficiency of professionals conducting a transaction that would have horrified anyone who understood its implications. Mackenzie felt a familiar anger building in her chest, the controlled fury that came from watching someone betray everything she had sworn to protect. Control, this is Raven. I have positive identification on both subjects. Request permission to proceed with the intercept. The response came back immediately, carrying the weight of authority that stretched all the way to Washington. Raven, you are cleared to engage. Seahawk is standing by for support. Ground team is in position. Remember, we need Volkov alive if possible. Mackenzie began her approach, the redemption cutting through the water with deceptive innocence. To anyone watching from the yacht, she would appear to be exactly what she claimed to be, a woman enjoying a peaceful morning of fishing, perhaps curious about the expensive boat anchored in the cove. The disguise was perfect, which made it all the more effective. In a world where threats were expected to arrive with fanfare and obvious intent, the greatest danger often came from the most unlikely sources. As she drew closer, Mackenzie could see the yacht's crew with perfect clarity. They were professionals, but they were also overconfident, secure in their belief that their remote location and superior firepower made them invulnerable. It was a mistake that she had seen repeated countless times throughout her career, the assumption that strength was the same as security, that superior numbers guaranteed victory. The Redemption was now within 500 yards of the yacht, close enough for Mackenzie to make out individual faces through her binoculars. She recognized Volkov immediately from the intelligence photos: silver hair, sharp features, and the kind of cold intelligence that marked truly dangerous opponents. He stood on the yacht's bridge, scanning the surrounding waters with the practiced eye of someone who had survived by being perpetually suspicious. Mackenzie's radio crackled with a final update from Control. Raven, all units are in position. You are authorized to commence the operation at your discretion. Good hunting. She felt the familiar calm descend over her, the operational focus that blocked out everything except the mission at hand. Fear, doubt, and uncertainty were luxuries she couldn't afford. There was only the target, the plan, and the absolute necessity of success. The Redemption continued its approach, maintaining the steady speed and course of a fishing boat whose captain had spotted an interesting location. Mackenzie made subtle adjustments to her position, bringing the yacht into perfect alignment with the weapon systems concealed beneath her boat's innocent exterior. In a few minutes, the morning's peaceful fishing expedition would transform into something far more deadly. She thought about the Coast Guard crew one more time, their faces haunted by the collision between their ordered world and the chaotic reality of her mission. They had done their duty, following orders and procedures that had served them well throughout their careers. But they had also glimpsed something that would change them forever: the knowledge that beneath the surface of ordinary life, extraordinary people fought battles that would never be recorded in history books. The yacht's crew had finally noticed the approaching fishing boat, but they showed no signs of alarm. Why would they? A middle-aged woman in a fleece jacket and deck shoes posed no threat to armed professionals with superior numbers and firepower. It was exactly the kind of assumption that Mackenzie had built her career on exploiting, the blindness that came from underestimating opponents who didn't fit conventional profiles. Mackenzie's hand moved to the concealed control panel, her fingers finding the familiar switches and buttons with the automatic precision of countless hours of training. The Redemption was no longer just a fishing boat. It was a weapons platform, a surveillance center, and a communications hub rolled into one deceptively innocent package. In the world of special operations, The most effective weapons were often the ones that nobody saw coming. The distance closed to 300 yards, then 200. Mackenzie could now see the expressions on the yacht's crew, the casual confidence of men who believed they controlled their environment. Volkov was still on the bridge, but he had turned his attention to the briefcase that Hartley had delivered, apparently satisfied that the morning's business was proceeding according to plan. It was time to show them how wrong they were. The transformation began with a soft mechanical hum that was barely audible above the sound of the Redemption's engines. Hidden panels slid open along the boat's hull, revealing sensors and weapons that would have been at home on a military vessel. The fishing poles retracted into concealed compartments, replaced by equipment that painted the yacht with invisible electronic signatures. What had been a peaceful morning fishing expedition was now a carefully orchestrated military operation. Mackenzie's first shot wasn't a bullet. It was an electronic pulse that disabled the yacht's communication systems and navigational equipment. The effect was immediate and devastating. The yacht's crew suddenly found themselves cut off from the outside world, their sophisticated electronics reduced to expensive paperweights. Emergency lights flickered on throughout the vessel, and Mackenzie could see figures running across the deck in obvious confusion. Control, this is Raven. Electronic warfare phase complete. Target is isolated and communications are down. The response came back immediately, professional and reassuring. Copy, Raven. Seahawk is inbound, ETA 2 minutes. Ground team reports ready for boarding action. The yacht's crew was recovering from their initial shock, and Mackenzie could see them bringing their weapons to bear on the Redemption. But their movements were sluggish, hampered by the electronic interference that had disrupted their targeting systems. The first shots went wide, sending geysers of water into the air around Mackenzie's boat but failing to find their mark. Mackenzie's response was swift and precise. The Redemption's concealed weapons systems engaged with the kind of overwhelming firepower that left no room for doubt about the outcome. The yacht's defensive positions were eliminated with surgical precision, each shot carefully placed to neutralize threats without destroying the evidence that intelligence analysts would need to unravel Volkov's entire network. The sound of rotor blades filled the air as the Seahawk helicopter appeared over the island's horizon, its crew ready to provide support and extraction if the mission went wrong. Mackenzie felt a familiar comfort at the sight of the aircraft. She had flown similar missions in other helicopters over other battlefields, and she knew that the crew would die before they abandoned her to face the enemy alone. On the yacht, Volkov was screaming orders in Russian, his calm demeanor finally cracking under the pressure of an operation that had gone catastrophically wrong. Mackenzie watched him through her binoculars, nodding the way his hands shook as he tried to coordinate a defense with equipment that no longer functioned properly. The arms dealer who had terrorized half the world was discovering what it felt like to be the hunted instead of the hunter. Hartley was trying to reach his boat, probably hopping to escape before the situation deteriorated further. But Mackenzie had anticipated this move, and her next shot disabled the interceptor's engines with a precision that would have impressed her instructors at the Naval War College. The former intelligence officer found himself trapped on a damaged yacht, surrounded by enemies who had every reason to want him dead. The yacht's crew was making a final desperate attempt to return fire, but their weapons were no match for the Redemption's advanced systems. Mackenzie methodically eliminated each threat, her shots guided by computers that calculated trajectories and compensated for wind and wave action with inhuman precision. Within minutes, the yacht's defensive capabilities were reduced to nothing more than small arms fire from increasingly desperate men. Raven, this is Seahawk. We have visual on the target. Request permission to commence boarding operations. Mackenzie's radio crackled with the voice of the helicopter's pilot, a woman whose calm professionalism reminded her of her own early days in special operations. Seahawk, this is Raven. Target is secure. You are clear to proceed. The helicopter descended toward the yacht with the kind of controlled aggression that marked elite military units. Fast ropes dropped from the aircraft's sides, and Mackenzie watched as black-clad figures slid down to the yacht's deck with the fluid grace of professionals who had performed this maneuver countless times. The boarding party moved with the coordination of a symphony orchestra, each member playing their part in a performance that had been rehearsed until it became second nature. Within minutes, the yacht was secure. Mackenzie could see the boarding party's leader speaking into his radio, probably reporting the successful capture of both primary targets. Volkov and Hartley were now in custody, their network of traitors and terrorists about to be exposed by intelligence analysts who specialized in unraveling complex conspiracies. But Mackenzie felt no satisfaction in the victory. She had prevented a disaster, saved countless lives, and eliminated a threat to national security. Yet she knew that tomorrow would bring new enemies, new betrayals, and new missions that would test her skills and resolve. The war against terror was a hydra, cut off one head, and two more would take its place. The Redemption began its journey back to the mainland, its mission complete, but its captain already thinking about the next assignment. Mackenzie looked back at the yacht one last time, watching as the boarding party prepared their prisoners for transport. Somewhere in the distance, she could see the Coast Guard cutter that had tried to intercept her earlier, probably wondering about the helicopters and explosions that had shattered the morning's peaceful routine. She thought about Webb and his crew, good men who had stumbled into a world they were never meant to see. They would file their reports, answer their superiors' questions, and eventually convince themselves that what they had witnessed was simply another example of the military's tendency toward excessive secrecy. They would never know that their professional restraint had helped preserve an operation that would save thousands of lives. The radio crackled with a message from Control. "Raven, this is Control. Mission accomplished. Well done. Return to base for debriefing and reassignment." Mackenzie acknowledged the transmission, but her mind was already moving ahead to the next challenge, the next enemy, the next battle in a war that would never end. As the Redemption disappeared into the morning mist, Mackenzie allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. She had chosen this life, accepted its costs and consequences, and dedicated herself to protecting people who would never know her name or understand her sacrifices. It was a lonely existence, but it was also a necessary one. In a world where evil wore suits and smiled for cameras, someone had to be willing to fight in the shadows. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the mist that had provided perfect cover for activities that couldn't bear the light of day. Soon, the sound would return to its normal rhythm of commercial traffic and pleasure craft, the morning's drama already fading into memory. But Mackenzie knew that beneath the surface of ordinary life, extraordinary people continued to fight battles that history would never record. The Redemption reached the mainland as the sun approached its zenith, transforming the waters of Puget Sound into a mirror of liquid gold. Mackenzie guided her boat toward a nondescript marina that appeared to cater to weekend fishermen and casual boaters. But the dock she approached was different from the others, longer, more heavily constructed, and equipped with security systems that were invisible to casual observers. As she secured the Redemption to the dock, Mackenzie noticed that she was no longer alone. A man in a Navy windbreaker stood waiting for her, his posture and bearing immediately identifying him as military despite his civilian clothes. She recognized him immediately, Colonel James Harrison, her handler and the man responsible for coordinating missions that fell outside normal military channels. "Outstanding work, Captain," Harrison said as Mackenzie stepped onto the dock. His voice carried the quiet satisfaction of someone who had just watched a perfect operation unfold exactly as planned. "The intelligence analysts are already working on the materials we recovered from the yacht. Early indications suggest that Volkov's network was even more extensive than we suspected." Mackenzie nodded, feeling the familiar mix of exhaustion and adrenaline that followed successful missions. "What about Hartley?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer. Harrison's expression darkened slightly, the look of someone who had seen too many good people make bad choices. He's talking. Seems that gambling debts were just the beginning. Volkov had photographs, recordings, evidence of activities that would have destroyed Hartley's family and career. The revelation didn't surprise Mackenzie. She had seen the pattern before, decent people trapped by circumstances, and gradually drawn into webs of compromise and betrayal. The intelligence community was filled with cautionary tales about officers who had started with small favors and ended up selling state secrets to foreign governments. It was a reminder that even the most carefully vetted personnel could be turned under the right circumstances. The Coast Guard crew, Mackenzie asked, remembering the faces of the men who had boarded her boat that morning. Harrison smiled slightly, the expression of someone who appreciated professional competence wherever he found it. They followed orders, asked no questions, and filed reports that contained exactly the right amount of detail. Webb is a good officer. He'll go far if he continues to demonstrate that kind of judgment. They walked together toward the marina's main building, passing other boats that looked perfectly normal but probably concealed capabilities that would have amazed civilian observers. The facility was one of dozens scattered around the country, safe houses and staging areas for operations that required the kind of deniability that official military bases couldn't provide. Inside the building, Mackenzie was greeted by a team of technicians who began the process of downloading data from the redemption systems. Every sensor reading, every communication intercept, every electronic signature would be analyzed by specialists who could extract intelligence from the most fragmentary evidence. The boat that had appeared to be a simple fishing vessel was actually a sophisticated intelligence-gathering platform, and the morning's operation had produced a treasure trove of information about Volkov's network. Harrison led Mackenzie to a secure conference room where banks of monitors displayed real-time updates from intelligence centers around the world. The scope of the operation was becoming clear. Volkov's arrest had triggered a cascade of raids and arrests from Berlin to Bangkok, as law enforcement agencies moved to roll up a network that had been years in the making. "The weapons shipment we intercepted last month," Harrison asked, referring to a previous operation that had seemed unrelated to the morning's activities. Mackenzie nodded, beginning to see the connections that intelligence analysts had been tracking for months. Volkov was the supplier. The same batch of Semtex that was supposed to reach Syrian rebels ended up in the hands of a cell planning attacks on European infrastructure. The implications were staggering. Mackenzie realized that the morning's operation had been far more significant than she had initially understood. By capturing Volkov and his network, they had prevented not just future attacks, but had also solved a series of incidents that had puzzled counterterrorism experts for years. The arms dealer's reach had extended far beyond anything they had suspected. A technician approached with a tablet displaying preliminary analysis results. "Ma'am, we've identified at least 17 active cells that were receiving support from the target's network. The financial transactions alone represent over $50 million in weapons sales over the past 2 years." Mackenzie studied the data, her trained eye immediately recognizing the patterns that indicated a sophisticated international conspiracy. But it was the final item on the list that made her blood run cold. Among the weapons that Volkov had been trafficking were components for improvised nuclear devices, not enough to build a complete weapon, but sufficient to create dirty bombs that could contaminate entire city blocks. The morning's fishing expedition had prevented a catastrophe that could have killed thousands and terrorized millions. Harrison noticed her expression and nodded grimly. "We've been tracking those components for 8 months. Every time we got close, they disappeared into Volkov's network. Thanks to your work, we've finally plugged that leak." He paused, studying Mackenzie's face with the concern of someone who had seen too many good officers burn out from the stress of their responsibilities. "You've prevented something that would have changed the world." Mackenzie felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. She had chosen this life, accepted its costs and consequences, and dedicated herself to protecting people who would never know her name or understand her sacrifices. But moments like this reminded her why the work was necessary, why someone had to be willing to fight in the shadows while others slept peacefully in their beds. The debriefing continued for hours, with specialists from various agencies asking detailed questions about every aspect of the operation. Mackenzie answered with the precision of someone who had been trained to observe and remember, her account providing crucial details that would help analysts understand the full scope of Volkov's network. But even as she spoke, part of her mind was already moving ahead to the next mission, the next enemy, the next battle in a war that would never end. As the sun began to set over Puget Sound, Mackenzie finally emerged from the debriefing room to find Harrison waiting for her with a cup of coffee and a concerned expression. "You need to take some time off," he said without preamble. "Real time off, not just the administrative leave that lets you sit in a hotel room and worry about the next assignment." Mackenzie accepted the coffee gratefully, feeling the exhaustion that always followed the adrenaline crash of a successful operation. "There's too much work to do," she replied, though she knew that Harrison was right. She had been running on adrenaline and determination for months, accepting mission after mission without pause for rest or reflection. "The work will still be there when you get back," Harrison said firmly. "But we can't afford to lose you to burnout. You're too valuable, and more importantly, you're too good a person to destroy yourself for this job." His words carried the authority of someone who had seen too many promising officers consumed by the demands of their profession. Mackenzie nodded reluctantly, knowing that Harrison's concerns were valid. She had seen other operators pushed past their breaking points, their effectiveness degraded by exhaustion and stress until they became liabilities rather than assets. The work required not just physical courage, but also the mental resilience to function effectively under conditions that would break ordinary people. "There's something else," Harrison continued, his expression growing more serious. "The president wants to meet with you, personal recognition for your work on the Volkov operation." Mackenzie felt a mixture of pride and apprehension at the news. Recognition from the highest levels of government was rare in her line of work, where success was often measured by the absence of headlines rather than their presence. "When?" she asked, though she already suspected that the meeting would be arranged around the president's schedule rather than her own convenience. Harrison smiled slightly, the expression of someone who had dealt with the demands of high-level politics many times before. "Next week. The ceremony will be private, of course. No press, no official records, just recognition from the people who understand what you've accomplished." Mackenzie thought about the Coast Guard crew she had encountered that morning, their faces haunted by the collision between their ordered world and the chaotic reality of her mission. They would never know that their professional restraint had helped preserve an operation that would save thousands of lives. The irony was not lost on her. The people who deserved recognition were often the ones who could never receive it. The marina had grown quiet as evening approached, with only the gentle lapping of waves against hulls to break the silence. Mackenzie walked to the end of the dock, looking out over the waters where the morning's drama had unfolded. The Redemption bobbed peacefully at its mooring, already being prepared for its next mission by technicians who understood that the boat's innocent appearance was its greatest weapon. She thought about the choice she had made years ago, when a recruiter had approached her about joining a unit that didn't officially exist. The pay was good, the work was important, and the risks were manageable for someone with her skills and experience. What the recruiter hadn't mentioned was the psychological cost of living a life where success was measured by disasters prevented rather than achievements celebrated. But Mackenzie had no regrets. She had chosen this path because someone had to do the work, and she had the skills and temperament to do it well. The world was full of people who wanted to harm innocent civilians, and it was her job to stop them before they could act. It was a responsibility that she carried with pride, even when the weight of it threatened to crush her. The radio in her pocket crackled with a message from Control. "Raven, This is control. We have a developing situation in the South China Sea. Chinese naval vessels have been detected approaching a shipping lane that's supposedly under international jurisdiction. Intelligence suggests they may be planning to intercept a cargo vessel carrying sensitive materials. Mackenzie listened to the briefing with the detached professionalism of someone who had heard similar reports countless times. The world was full of crises, each one requiring the kind of careful response that balanced diplomacy with the threat of force. Somewhere in the Pentagon, planners were already working on contingencies that might require her unique combination of skills and experience. Acknowledged control. What's the timeline? The response came back immediately, carrying the urgency that marked developing situations. 12 hours until the cargo vessel reaches the intercept point. We need someone on scene to provide eyes and ears for the diplomatic team. Your cover would be a marine biology research vessel studying whale migration patterns. Mackenzie felt the familiar stirring of operational focus, the mental shift from exhaustion to alertness that had kept her alive through dozens of missions. The South China Sea was a complex operating environment, with multiple navies patrolling waters that were claimed by several different countries. Any mistake could escalate into the kind of international incident that made headlines and toppled governments. But that was exactly why they needed someone with her experience. Mackenzie had operated in those waters before, during a mission that had involved tracking a North Korean submarine that was suspected of carrying nuclear weapons. She understood the political sensitivities and the tactical challenges that made the region one of the most dangerous places on Earth for military operations. "I'll need 6 hours to prepare," Mackenzie said, her mind already working through the equipment and cover stories that would be required for the mission. "And I'll need a crew that can maintain the marine biology cover while I focus on the intelligence gathering." Control's response was immediate and professional. "Already arranged. Dr. Sarah Chen and her team are standing by. They're legitimate researchers who have worked with us before." Mackenzie nodded, feeling the familiar comfort of working with professionals who understood the demands of covert operations. The best cover stories were based on real activities, and having actual marine biologists on board would make the deception nearly perfect. The Chinese Navy would see exactly what they expected to see: a research vessel conducting legitimate scientific work in international waters. As she prepared to leave the marina, Mackenzie took one last look at the waters of Puget Sound. The morning's operation had been successful, but it was already becoming history, filed away in classified reports that would be read by analysts and planners who were already focused on the next crisis. The work never ended, and neither did the need for people who were willing to risk everything to protect others. The drive to the airport was quiet, with Harrison lost in his own thoughts about the challenges that lay ahead. Mackenzie used the time to review the intelligence reports about the South China Sea situation, memorizing details that might prove crucial in the hours to come. The cargo vessel was carrying components for a new radar system that would give the U.S. Navy a significant advantage in detecting stealth aircraft. If it fell into Chinese hands, the balance of power in the Pacific would shift dramatically. At the airport, Mackenzie was met by a team of technicians who had already prepared the equipment she would need for the mission. The marine biology research vessel was actually a sophisticated intelligence-gathering platform, equipped with sensors that could track submarine movements and communication systems that could reach satellites anywhere in the world. Like the Redemption, it was a weapon disguised as something completely innocent. Dr. Sarah Chen was waiting for her at the departure gate, a slight woman in her 40s whose academic credentials were impressive enough to fool any intelligence service. But Mackenzie could see the signs of someone who had worked with the military before. The way she stood, the alertness in her eyes, the calm professionalism that marked people who had been tested under pressure. "Captain Mackenzie," Chen said, extending her hand with a firm grip. "I've read your service record. It's an honor to work with you." Mackenzie returned the handshake, nodding the calluses that suggested Chen was as comfortable with field work as she was with laboratory research. "The honor is mine, Doctor. I've reviewed your published papers. Your work on cetacean migration patterns is exactly the kind of cover we need." The flight to Hawaii was long and quiet, with Mackenzie using the time to study satellite imagery of the South China Sea and memorize the profiles of Chinese naval officers who might be involved in the operation. The intelligence picture was still developing, but it was clear that the Chinese were planning something that went beyond routine patrols of disputed waters. As the plane descended toward Honolulu, Mackenzie thought about the Coast Guard crew she had encountered that morning. They were probably finishing their shift, writing reports about the strange encounter with the fishing boat that had carried credentials they weren't supposed to see. They would go home to families who would never know how their professionalism had helped preserve an operation that saved thousands of lives. The cycle was beginning again. New mission, new dangers, new opportunities to make a difference in a world that was far more complex and dangerous than most people realized. Mackenzie felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and apprehension that marked the beginning of every operation, the knowledge that success was never guaranteed and failure could have consequences that rippled around the world. But she also felt the quiet satisfaction of someone who had found their calling, who had discovered work that was not just a job but a vocation. The world needed people who were willing to fight in the shadows, who could operate in the gray areas where conventional military forces couldn't go. It was a responsibility that she carried with pride, even when the weight of it threatened to crush her. The research vessel Pacific Pioneer was waiting at Pearl Harbor, its hull gleaming white in the afternoon sun. To casual observers, it would appear to be exactly what it claimed to be, a scientific research vessel equipped for the study of marine mammals. But Mackenzie's trained eye could see the subtle modifications that marked it as something far more sophisticated. Dr. Chen's team was already aboard, setting up equipment that would make their cover story completely convincing. Mackenzie watched them work with the efficiency of professionals who had performed this deception many times before. Hydrophones that could detect whale songs were positioned alongside sensors that could track submarine movements. Cameras designed to film marine life were equipped with lenses that could photograph naval vessels from miles away. The briefing room was located below deck, hidden behind what appeared to be a marine biology laboratory. The walls were lined with monitors that displayed real-time intelligence updates from around the Pacific, and the air hummed with the subtle electronic sounds of sophisticated communications equipment. This was the nerve center of an operation that would determine whether a crucial technology fell into Chinese hands. Colonel Harrison's voice crackled through the secure communication system, his tone carrying the urgency of someone who was tracking a developing crisis. The cargo vessel Maritime Explorer is 6 hours out from the intercept point. Chinese naval vessels are converging on the area, including at least one submarine that we've been tracking for the past week. Mackenzie studied the tactical display, noting the positions of the various vessels and the complex web of international waters, territorial claims, and military patrol zones that made the South China Sea one of the most dangerous places on Earth for naval operations. Any mistake could escalate into the kind of international incident that made headlines and toppled governments. But that was exactly why they needed someone with her experience. Mackenzie had operated in these waters before, during missions that had tested her skills and resolve in ways that few people could understand. She knew the players, understood the stakes, and had the kind of calm professionalism that was essential for operations where the margin for error was measured in heartbeats. "What's our cover story?" Mackenzie asked, though she already suspected the answer. Dr. Chen smiled slightly, the expression of someone who had perfected the art of academic deception. "We're studying the migration patterns of humpback whales through the South China Sea. Perfectly legitimate research that gives us a reason to be in the area for several days." The Pacific Pioneer left Pearl Harbor as the sun began to set, its diesel engines driving it toward a rendezvous with destiny in waters that had been contested for centuries. Mackenzie stood on the bridge, watching the lights of Honolulu fade into the distance, knowing that the next few days would test her skills and resolve in ways that she couldn't yet imagine. The radio crackled with updates from intelligence centers around the world, each message adding new pieces to a puzzle that was becoming more complex by the hour. The Chinese weren't just planning to intercept the cargo vessel. They were positioning forces for a much larger operation that could reshape the balance of power in the Pacific. Mackenzie thought about the Coast Guard crew she had encountered that morning, their faces haunted by the collision between their ordered world and the chaotic reality of international espionage. They would never know that their professional restraint had helped preserve not just one operation, but a series of missions that would determine the future of American influence in the Pacific. The Pacific Pioneer cut through the waves with the steady rhythm of a vessel on a scientific mission, its crew going through the motions of legitimate research while preparing for activities that would never appear in any academic journal. Mackenzie felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders, the knowledge that success or failure could have consequences that rippled around the world. But she also felt the quiet confidence of someone who had been tested under fire and emerged victorious. The world was full of people who wanted to harm American interests, and it was her job to stop them before they could act. It was a responsibility that she carried with pride, even when the weight of it threatened to crush her. The South China Sea stretched endlessly ahead, its waters hiding secrets that could change the course of history. Somewhere in those depths, submarines moved like predators, their crews preparing for conflicts that might never be acknowledged by the governments that sent them. And on the surface, vessels like the Pacific Pioneer maintained the fiction of peaceful commerce while preparing for the kind of confrontation that could determine the fate of nations. Mackenzie checked her equipment one more time, ensuring that everything was ready for the challenges that lay ahead. The morning's encounter with the Coast Guard seemed like a lifetime ago, but it had been just the beginning of a day that would test her skills and resolve in ways that few people could understand. The hunt for Volkov was over, but the war against those who would threaten American interests would continue. As the Pacific Pioneer disappeared into the gathering darkness, Mackenzie allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. She had chosen this life, accepted its costs and consequences, and dedicated herself to protecting people who would never know her name or understand her sacrifices. It was a lonely existence, but it was also a necessary one. In a world where evil wore suits and smiled for cameras, someone had to be willing to fight in the shadows. The radio crackled with a final message from Control. "Raven, this is Control. Weather reports indicate clear skies over the target area. You should have perfect conditions for the operation. Good hunting." Mackenzie acknowledged the transmission, but her mind was already focused on the mission ahead. The South China Sea was waiting, and with it, challenges that would test everything she had learned about courage, duty, and the price of keeping the world safe. The voyage to the South China Sea took 18 hours, with the Pacific Pioneer maintaining the steady course and speed of a legitimate research vessel. Mackenzie used the time to study intelligence reports and coordinate with other units that were positioning themselves for the complex operation ahead. The cargo vessel Maritime Explorer was still on course, but Chinese naval forces were moving to intercept it in what appeared to be a carefully planned operation. Dr. Chen's team performed their roles with the consummate professionalism of people who understood that their lives might depend on the quality of their deception. They deployed hydrophones, collected water samples, and maintained the kind of detailed logs that would satisfy any inspection by curious naval officers. The cover story was perfect, which made it all the more effective. But beneath the surface of scientific routine, the Pacific Pioneer was preparing for something far more dangerous. Mackenzie worked with her team to calibrate sensors that could detect submarine movements at distances that would have impressed the designers of nuclear attack boats. Communications equipment was tested and retested, ensuring that they would be able to maintain contact with command centers even in the face of electronic jamming. The first sign of trouble came just before dawn, when the ship's radar detected multiple contacts converging on their position. Mackenzie studied the tactical display, noting the formation and approach vectors that marked the contacts as military vessels. The Chinese Navy was making its move, and the Pacific Pioneer was about to find itself in the middle of an international incident. "Dr. Chen to the bridge," Mackenzie called over the ship's intercom. The marine biologist appeared within minutes, her academic credentials ready to deflect any questions about their presence in these contested waters. "We're about to have company," Mackenzie said, handing Chen a pair of binoculars. "Remember, we're studying whale migration patterns, nothing else." The Chinese naval vessels appeared on the horizon like gray ghosts, their hulls cutting through the morning mist with the kind of purposeful aggression that marked warships on a mission. Mackenzie counted at least 3 destroyers and what appeared to be a guided missile frigate, more than enough firepower to sink any vessel that refused to cooperate with their demands. The radio crackled with a transmission in accented English. "Research Vessel Pacific Pioneer. This is the People's Liberation Army Navy. You are operating in territorial waters of the People's Republic of China. Prepare to be boarded for inspection." The message was polite but carried undertones of barely contained threat. Dr. Chen responded with the kind of academic confusion that was perfect for the situation. "Chinese naval vessel. This is the Research Vessel Pacific Pioneer. We are conducting legitimate scientific research in international waters. We have all proper permits and documentation." Her voice carried just the right mixture of authority and bewilderment. Mackenzie watched the Chinese vessels through her binoculars, noting their aggressive positioning and the way their weapons systems were tracking the Pacific Pioneer. These were not routine patrol vessels conducting a standard inspection. They were part of a coordinated operation that was designed to intercept the cargo vessel and seize its precious cargo. The lead Chinese destroyer moved closer, its deck crowded with armed sailors who were clearly prepared for more than a routine inspection. Mackenzie could see officers on the bridge studying the Pacific Pioneer through their own binoculars, probably trying to determine whether the research vessel posed any threat to their operation. "Dr. Chen," Mackenzie said quietly, "maintain your cover but be prepared to move quickly if the situation deteriorates. These aren't routine patrol vessels." The marine biologist nodded, her academic demeanor masking the kind of calm professionalism that came from working with military units in dangerous situations. The Chinese boarding party approached in a high-speed boat that was clearly designed for military operations rather than routine inspections. Mackenzie counted at least 8 armed sailors, their weapons held with the casual competence of professionals who were prepared for resistance. The inspection was going to be thorough, and any mistakes in their cover story could have fatal consequences. As the boarding party climbed aboard the Pacific Pioneer, Mackenzie felt the familiar calm descend over her, the operational focus that blocked out everything except the mission at hand. The morning's encounter with the Coast Guard seemed like a lifetime ago, but the lessons learned there would serve her well in the confrontation that was about to unfold. The Chinese officer in charge of the boarding party was a young lieutenant with the kind of serious demeanor that marked rising stars in any military organization. He approached Dr. Chen with the courtesy that was expected in international waters, but his eyes were constantly scanning the ship for signs of anything that might threaten Chinese interests. "Dr. Chen," the lieutenant said in careful English, "I am Lieutenant Wang of the People's Liberation Army Navy. We are conducting routine security operations in these waters. I hope you will cooperate with our inspection." His words were polite, but the armed sailors flanking him made it clear that cooperation was not optional. Dr. Chen responded with the kind of academic authority that had served her well in universities around the world. "Of course, Lieutenant Wang. We are conducting research on humpback whale migration patterns. All of our equipment and documentation are available for your inspection." She gestured toward the marine biology laboratory, where her team was maintaining the fiction of legitimate scientific research. Mackenzie watched the inspection from the bridge, noting the thoroughness with which the Chinese sailors examined every piece of equipment. They were clearly looking for something specific, probably electronic surveillance gear, that would indicate the Pacific Pioneer was more than it appeared to be. The disguise was good, but it would only hold up under the kind of scrutiny that these professionals were bringing to bear. The critical moment came when one of the Chinese sailors discovered the communications equipment that was hidden behind what appeared to be a computer used for analyzing whale songs. Mackenzie held her breath, knowing that the wrong response could turn the inspection into a firefight that would leave everyone dead. But Dr. Chen handled the situation with the kind of academic aplomb that made her deception perfect. "Oh, that's our satellite communication system," she said with the casual dismissal of someone discussing routine equipment. "We need to maintain contact with our research station for weather updates and emergency communications. Standard equipment for any vessel operating this far from shore." Lieutenant Wang studied the equipment with the suspicious eye of someone who had been trained to recognize intelligence-gathering devices. But the cover story was perfect, and the equipment had been carefully disguised to appear exactly like what Chen claimed it to be. After several tense minutes, he nodded and moved on to the next compartment. The inspection continued for over an hour, with the Chinese sailors examining every inch of the Pacific Pioneer. Mackenzie watched from the bridge, her hand never far from the concealed weapons that would be her last resort if the deception failed. But Dr. Chen's team maintained their roles with the kind of professionalism that made the cover story completely convincing. Finally, Lieutenant Wang returned to the bridge, his inspection complete and his suspicions apparently satisfied. "Dr. Chen, your documentation appears to be in order. However, I must advise you that these waters are currently restricted due to naval exercises. For your own safety, I recommend that you move your research to a different area." The warning was polite but carried the unmistakable tone of a military order. Mackenzie knew that the Chinese were clearing the area in preparation for their intercept of the cargo vessel, and any civilian ships that remained in the area would be at risk of being caught in the crossfire. "Of course, Lieutenant Wang," Dr. Chen replied with the kind of academic courtesy that was perfect for the situation. "We certainly don't want to interfere with your exercises. We'll move our research to a safer location." Her response was exactly what the Chinese officer wanted to hear, and Mackenzie could see the relief in his eyes as he prepared to leave. As the Chinese boarding party returned to their destroyer, Mackenzie felt the familiar mixture of relief and anticipation that marked the successful completion of one phase of an operation. The cover story had held, but the real work was just beginning. Somewhere in these waters, the cargo vessel Maritime Explorer was approaching its rendezvous with destiny, and the Pacific Pioneer was the only thing standing between the Chinese Navy and a technology that could change the balance of power in the Pacific. The Chinese naval vessels resumed their formation, moving away from the Pacific Pioneer with the kind of purposeful aggression that marked warships on a mission. But Mackenzie knew that they would be back, and next time, they might not be satisfied with a routine inspection. The hunt for the cargo vessel was about to begin in earnest, and the outcome would determine whether crucial American technology fell into Chinese hands. Dr. Chen joined Mackenzie on the bridge, her academic facade dropping away to reveal the kind of calm professionalism that came from years of working with military units in dangerous situations. "How long do we have?" she asked, studying the tactical display that showed the positions of the various vessels converging on their location. 4 hours until the Maritime Explorer reaches the intercept point," Mackenzie replied, her mind already working through the tactical challenges that lay ahead. "The Chinese will position themselves to force the cargo vessel into territorial waters, where they can claim legal authority to board and inspect it. Once they have the radar components, the balance of power in the Pacific shifts dramatically. The Pacific Pioneer began to move, ostensibly relocating its research to safer waters, but actually positioning itself to observe the coming confrontation. Mackenzie knew that her role was to provide real-time intelligence to American naval forces, but she also understood that the situation could escalate quickly into something far more dangerous than a routine intercept. The radio crackled with updates from intelligence centers around the world, each message adding new pieces to a puzzle that was becoming more complex by the hour. The Chinese weren't just planning to intercept one cargo vessel. They were positioning forces for a much larger operation that could reshape the balance of power in the Pacific. As the Pacific Pioneer took its position to observe the coming confrontation, Mackenzie thought about the Coast Guard crew she had encountered that morning. They would never know that their professional restraint had helped preserve not just one operation, but a series of missions that would determine the future of American influence in the Pacific. The work never ended, and neither did the need for people who were willing to risk everything to protect others. The South China Sea stretched endlessly in all directions, its waters hiding secrets that could change the course of history. Somewhere in those depths, submarines moved like predators, their crews preparing for conflicts that might never be acknowledged by the governments that sent them. And on the surface, vessels like the Pacific Pioneer maintained the fiction of peaceful research while preparing for the kind of confrontation that could determine the fate of nations. Mackenzie checked her equipment one more time, ensuring that everything was ready for the challenges that lay ahead. The morning's encounter with Volkov seemed like a lifetime ago, but it had been just the beginning of a day that would test her skills and resolve in ways that few people could understand. The hunt for the arms dealer was over, but the war for technological supremacy in the Pacific was just beginning. The cargo vessel Maritime Explorer appeared on the horizon exactly on schedule, its hull riding low in the water under the weight of its precious cargo. Mackenzie watched through her binoculars as the Chinese naval vessels moved to intercept it, their formation designed to force the cargo ship into territorial waters where they could claim legal authority to board and inspect it. The confrontation began with radio communications that were polite, but carried undertones of barely contained threat. The Chinese demanded the right to inspect the cargo vessel for contraband, while the American captain insisted that he was operating in international waters and had every right to continue his voyage. It was a diplomatic dance that had been performed countless times in these contested waters, but this time the stakes were higher than usual. Mackenzie activated the Pacific Pioneer's surveillance systems, recording every detail of the confrontation for analysis by intelligence specialists who would study the footage for clues about Chinese naval capabilities and tactics. The information would be crucial for planning future operations in these dangerous waters. The Chinese destroyer moved closer to the cargo vessel, its deck crowded with armed sailors who were clearly prepared for more than a routine inspection. Mackenzie could see officers on the bridge studying the Maritime Explorer through their binoculars, probably trying to determine the exact nature of its cargo and the best way to seize it without triggering an international incident. But the American captain was not going to make it easy for them. The Maritime Explorer began to increase speed, its engines driving it toward the safety of international waters where the Chinese would have no legal authority to interfere with its passage. The race was on, and the outcome would determine whether crucial American technology fell into Chinese hands. The Chinese response was swift and overwhelming. The destroyer fired warning shots across the cargo vessel's bow, the sound of the guns echoing across the water like thunder. The message was clear: stop or be sunk. The Maritime Explorer had no choice but to comply, its engines winding down as it prepared to be boarded by Chinese forces. Mackenzie watched the boarding action through her binoculars, noting the professionalism with which the Chinese sailors went about their work. They were not pirates or criminals. They were professional military personnel carrying out orders that had been carefully planned at the highest levels of government. The operation was a carefully calculated escalation in the ongoing struggle for dominance in the Pacific. The radio crackled with a transmission from the Maritime Explorer's captain. "This is an illegal seizure of an American vessel in international waters. I protest this action and demand immediate release." His words were transmitted on frequencies that would be monitored by American naval forces, but Mackenzie knew that help was too far away to prevent the Chinese from accomplishing their mission. The Chinese boarding party worked with the kind of efficiency that marked elite military units. They quickly identified the cargo containers that held the radar components, ignoring the other freight that was designed to provide cover for the real purpose of the voyage. Within minutes, they had located and secured the technology that could give them a significant advantage in detecting American stealth aircraft. Mackenzie felt the familiar frustration of watching an operation unfold without being able to intervene. The Pacific Pioneer was supposed to be a research vessel, and any aggressive action would blow their cover and probably result in their destruction. But she also understood that sometimes the most important victories were won by gathering intelligence rather than engaging in direct confrontation. The surveillance data she was collecting would be crucial for understanding Chinese naval capabilities and tactics. Every detail of the operation was being recorded and analyzed, providing intelligence that would help American forces plan future operations in these contested waters. The Maritime Explorer might have been lost, but the information gained from observing its capture would be invaluable. As the Chinese forces prepared to take the cargo vessel to one of their naval bases, Mackenzie made a decision that would haunt her for years to come. The Pacific Pioneer began to move, ostensibly resuming its research activities, but actually positioning itself to observe the route that the Chinese would take with their prize. The intelligence would be crucial for planning rescue operations or future interdiction efforts. The radio crackled with a message from Control. "Raven, this is Control. We have naval forces moving to intercept, but they're 6 hours out. Continue surveillance and report any changes in the situation." Mackenzie acknowledged the transmission, knowing that the cavalry was coming but probably too late to prevent the Chinese from reaching the safety of their territorial waters. The Chinese convoy began to move, with the captured cargo vessel surrounded by destroyers and frigates that were clearly prepared for any attempt at rescue. Mackenzie followed at a distance, maintaining the fiction of marine biology research while actually tracking the movement of forces that could reshape the balance of power in the Pacific. The pursuit continued for hours, with the Chinese convoy moving steadily toward territorial waters where they would be safe from any American response. Mackenzie watched through her binoculars as the Maritime Explorer disappeared into the distance, its precious cargo now in the hands of a government that would use it to threaten American interests throughout the Pacific. But the mission was not over. The intelligence gathered during the operation would be crucial for understanding Chinese naval capabilities and planning future operations in these contested waters. Mackenzie had failed to prevent the capture of the cargo vessel, but she had succeeded in gathering information that would be invaluable for protecting American interests in the years to come. As the Pacific Pioneer began its journey back to Pearl Harbor, Mackenzie reflected on the events of the day. The morning's encounter with the Coast Guard seemed like a lifetime ago, but it had been just the beginning of a series of operations that would test her skills and resolve in ways that few people could understand. The hunt for Volkov was over, and the cargo vessel had been lost, but the war for technological supremacy in the Pacific would continue. The radio crackled with a final message from Control. "Raven, this is Control. Mission accomplished. The intelligence you gathered will be crucial for planning future operations. Well done." Mackenzie acknowledged the transmission, but she felt no satisfaction in the victory. She had prevented one disaster and witnessed another, and tomorrow would bring new challenges that would test her skills and resolve. The voyage back to Pearl Harbor was quiet, with Dr. Chen's team maintaining their marine biology research, while Mackenzie processed the intelligence that had been gathered during the operation. The Chinese had succeeded in capturing the cargo vessel, but they had also revealed capabilities and tactics that would be crucial for American forces to understand. As the lights of Honolulu appeared on the horizon, Mackenzie thought about the choices she had made and the life she had chosen. The world was full of people who wanted to harm American interests, and it was her job to stop them when possible and gather intelligence when intervention was not feasible. It was a responsibility that she carried with pride, even when the weight of it threatened to crush her. The debriefing would be long and detailed, with specialists from various agencies asking questions about every aspect of the operation. Mackenzie would answer with the precision of someone who had been trained to observe and remember, her account providing crucial details that would help analysts understand the full scope of Chinese naval capabilities. But even as she prepared for the debriefing, part of her mind was already moving ahead to the next mission, the next enemy, the next battle in a war that would never end. The work never stopped, and neither did the need for people who were willing to risk everything to protect others. It was a lonely existence, but it was also a necessary one.